All right. It's just Monday afternoon. We finished our class a little while ago, but I wanted to go over this because I ended up moving a little bit too quickly through some of the first portion of our class, and so I just wanted to go over this um, and make sure that everybody had a chance to catch a few of these major things that we discussed. Um, and I also am going to share a video or share a playlist, a YouTube playlist from a Stanford professor, Tom Mullaney, talking about going into several short explainer videos of Qing dynasty history. So I'll share that in addition to this quick introduction. We did our housekeeping. We assigned readings. And for those who did not, we assigned readings for the first 2 weeks. I had a few volunteers. About 10 of the students already volunteered for the first 2 weeks, and I'll assign reading leaders in our next session, and I'll also just make sure that everybody's clear on what sessions they're going to lead on. We talked about that. And I also forgot to mention, we went through this quickly. Next Monday, so Monday um, the 15th, we're going to talk about the research project and what my expectations for that are going to be and how we're going to scaffold that. So we'll talk in a little bit more detail about all that. And of course, both of the books should be available through the library as ebooks. The second book is pending a purchase, I think, the Salman Khan Taiwan book, Struggle for Taiwan. That book is pending a ebook final purchase approval. But once that goes through, you should have access to both of the books as ebooks. So that's good news. You should be able to read them both through the NTU library. Okay, so we moved through some of this very quickly, and I just want to take a few minutes, maybe about 10 minutes, just to go through some of this material. This is what we started with, and we spent a little bit of time on this, New Qing history. And Tsai Min Yuan, our TA, wrote a few examples of new Qing historians on the board. I think this is an important historiographical corrective to the Western impact theory of Fairbank, but it also challenges some of the Chinese nationalist views of Sinicization, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But new Qing historians include people like Peter Perdue, William Rowe, Pamela Crossley, and a number of other historians. And this is a nice, I think, correction again to earlier schools of thought. Okay, so these three we talked about very briefly, and the ways in which in the late 1700s, the ways in which the Qing perceived the United States or Europe more broadly, and Americans or Europeans who had a big influence in America in the United States viewed China and the Qing dynasty. We talked about the importance, of course, of the trade, tea, luxury goods, but also culturally remember the history of Marco Polo and from the 13th century traveler to the Yuan dynasty court, and the idea of China or Asia as exotic or different or a land of adventure. And I think it's important to remember that although Marco Polo did bring back some very valuable insights and important information about the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Yuan dynasty. He also had sections about sort of monsters and bizarre animals, sort of impossible oddities and that kind of thing, that were intended, I think, to sort of excite and titillate his audience, but did not obviously reflect anything that he encountered there. So that aspect, I think, is one part of the sort of fascination with China as exotic. And then these other guys here, Voltaire, Thomas Paine, and Benjamin Franklin. Voltaire, of course, is French. Paine, who's sort of Anglo-American, and then Franklin. Um, they admired the meritocratic aspects of Chinese society, especially, and the civil service examination, which had taken the place of any kind of Chinese aristocracy, really for about 2,000 years, and in a more thoroughgoing and institutional way from 605 in the Sui dynasty until 1905 at the end of the Qing dynasty. So the examination, the civil service examination system as a system of functional meritocracy was something that people like Voltaire and Paine and Franklin, who really were frustrated with a British, European, French aristocracy, could look to as an example of functional meritocracy. That is promotion based on merit and ability as opposed to hereditary power, nobility. They saw it as a secular regime. I think that could be questions in some respects, but certainly compared to the church-aligned aristocracy that they were so frustrated with, I think that it was relatively secular. And they could look to the enlightened monarchs of the High Qing dynasty, which we'll talk about in just a second, as I think, again, sort of the exceptions to the rule of autocratic, authoritarian types of monarchs that they observed in their time. And I think Frederick the Great, I mentioned in class, of Prussia is maybe one example of an actual enlightened monarch, according to what their estimates might track with. So we'll come back to this term Orientalism again, that idea of the sort of pure exotic. I think that Orientalism, like any kind of racialized cultural stereotypes, has multiple sides to it, right? So we can think of a positive kind of Orientalism, maybe, but then there is also a flip side of it. And in either way, it's a kind of essentialization and simplification of a culture in a way that we don't generally do. One does not do that kind of thing for themselves, except in unusual circumstances. The self is sort of contains multitudes, as the poet says, but I don't think that kind of conception applies to the so-called other. Okay, and then perception from the Qing. The Qing didn't really encounter the United States very much, but it did have some encounters with Europeans in this late 18th century, prior to the Empress of China, the American privateer, repurposed privateer. It did encounter Jesuits and Franciscans, Dominicans, various Catholics, especially the Jesuits, I think. And I noted in class also that these Catholic missionaries had a primary priority was proximity to their counterparts, that is, their elite intellectual counterparts in the Qing dynasty, up to and including the emperor himself, in an effort to convert the emperor and convert some of these very high-ranking scholar officials, in the hope that their conversions would then lead to a sort of trickling down of Catholicism. I know this because it's very different from what's going to come next with the Protestants, who are not going to be satisfied with being literally cloistered away among the scholar officials and the elites, and rather the Protestants, the Presbyterians, and others, they're going to want to get out among the people in the villages, in the countryside, proselytizing face to face with Chinese people, as many as possible, and building hospitals and orphanages and schools as a way of encountering the Chinese people. So that's very different from what the Jesuits are doing in this first stage. So I just sort of hint at that because that's what's coming next. We did talk about this in a little bit more detail, so I don't want to go over this too much here, but the Empress of China is the name of the repurposed privateer. The privateer is a private ship that is commissioned for war during times of war. The Empress of China is repurposed as a highly effective merchant ship, and it is very lucrative. It's clear that this is very, very lucrative trade. The early traders who send the Empress of China and sail with it, of course, are happy to, not happy, but they're willing to um, align themselves with a canton system. Canton, as in Guangzhou, uh, the southern city. It's where we get our word Cantonese language. Um, Southern or Yueyu, Chinese language. And the traders also, the merchants are able to stay more long term in Macau or Aumen. Samuel Shaw, there pictured at the right, is the first U.S. consul to China, and the Qing government is especially eager to keep the foreign presence in Guangzhou, in Canton. Remember, the capital is way up in Beijing, so Guangzhou is in some senses a sort of safe distance from Beijing. And so the foreigners are kind of kept at arm's length there. We talked a little bit about the Hai Ching, and I'm going to share those Tom Mulaney videos in our module 1 as well. But I think this is very important. We talked about Manchu rule as framing itself as conquering the violent upheaval and the rebels that brought down the Ming Dynasty. So, of course, in many respects, the Qing does overthrow the Ming, but there was a brief interregnum called the Shun that tried to frame itself as a new legitimate dynasty, but it was clearly a rebel dynasty that never really found its footing. And that when the Qing knocks them out of power, one of the first things they do is they go and they make sacrifice, they make offerings at the Ming tombs in order to say we are the next in a legitimate line of rulers, and we are going to honor the Ming. And they even go so far as to have the reign name of the first emperor of the Qing dynasty is Shun Shi, is the conqueror, the vanquisher of the Shun, not Ming Shi, not conqueror of the Ming. And I think that's important because the Manchus who rule the Qing dynasty are very savvy, and they're able to frame themselves in a way that is ultimately satisfying for many of their regional neighbors and for the Han Chinese elites as well in honoring the Ming and in framing themselves as the vanquishers of the rebellious interregnum Shun dynasty. So the Qing is going to run from 1644 to 1911, but the Hai Qing, or the period of great prosperity, is going to really run from about 1650, 1660 to about 1800. And that's when things are going to start to fall apart. A big reason at the end of the Qianlong Emperor's reign that things are falling apart is the simple fact of the economic pressures of a tripling population. Doubling by that time is moving toward tripling. And the inflexibility of the governing structure to expand in a dynamic way to accommodate that growing population. And part of that is that the Manchus are eager to demonstrate that they are more Confucian than the Confucians, because one of the major virtues of Confucian governance is frugality and having a small government. And so there's a great reluctance to increase the size of government or the number of magistrates or local county level officials, because doing so would be in the Confucian view a kind of legalist big government solution to the problem, rather than a Confucian rule by virtuous magistrates who can tend to all the affairs of state with a light touch. And that's a sort of Confucian ideal. And the harsh reality of a tripling population that triples the number of duties that a magistrate has, magistrate being the county level official, is ultimately going to test the efficacy of what had been very effective rule under the Qing for about 150 years. Another big factor is that toward the end of the third of these guys, Kangxi Yongzheng and then Qianlong, under the Qianlong reign, we're going to see increasing corruption at the local level as a result of this swelling population, increasing population, in the face of reluctance to expand the magistracy, the number of magistrates, but also at the highest level. And there are a few sort of soap opera stories there that go along with this. One is the Qianlong's one of his top level advisors, a guy named He Shun. He Shun is wildly corrupt, spectacularly corrupt. There's a real soap opera story about the Qianlong emperor and his relationship with He Shun. Some speculating that they had a romantic entanglement. I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but that according to one version of events, the Qianlong emperor as a boy once startled one of his favorite sort of aunties in the harem, one of his favorite concubines. He startled her, he scared her as a sort of a kid's joke, and she got so frightened she turned around and sort of instinctively gave him a slap on the cheek. Now this is a concubine or woman in the harem. Who has now slapped the crown prince, and she ultimately is executed for it. And according to this version, the Qianlong emperor is ridden with guilt for his whole life. And one day he's walking through the palace and he sees a face that looks just like this concubine whose death he felt responsible for. And that turns out to be a young man named He Shun. And the rest is history, as they say. This is the soap opera version. This is this sort of acute sort of dramatic soap opera version. Ultimately, according to this version, the Qianlong emperor lavishes all of his affections and all of his attentions on this young man, who becomes spectacularly corrupt, is a war profiteer amidst all the rebellions of the time. This is sort of a sort of scandalous soap opera version, but I think it's just a bit of fun. What it does, I think, reflect is that the corruption at the local level did indeed carry up to the top. So that while some of the more salacious details of the relationship between the Qianlong Emperor and He Shun are maybe exaggerated to sort of keep the attention of students of history, I think that the fact of rampant corruption throughout the Qing government as we get into the 1790s especially becomes a huge problem among many people who can observe that He Shun and others with access to the Qianlong Emperor are enormously corrupt, but because they have the favor of the Qianlong Emperor, they can't really be touched. And so soon after the Qianlong Emperor dies, in the early 1800s, you see a sort of scramble in which a lot of these people are taken out by the successors. But we'll come back to that. The dynamics between the Manchus and the Han, I think, are very, very important here. So through the High Qing, again, what I was talking about in terms of the corruption really only happened toward the end of the 1700s, toward the end of the Qianlong reign. Up until that point, the dynamics between the Manchus and Han had been quite effectively managed. But I do want you to remember that this queue hairstyle with a long braid in the back and the forelocks shaven, both those things have to happen for the queue. It's not just growing a long braid, it's also shaving the forelock. When those things happen in 1645, there's great pushback and a number of rebellions and uprisings after the Qing had already consolidated power. These uprisings then are put down, forcibly put down, and the relationship between Manchus and Han, as a result, is strained. I think, and is strained for the duration of the dynasty. This then gets us into that question of whether the Manchus Sinicize. Did the Manchus become Chinese? This is a big political question in China. It touches back on the New Qing history, because New Qing history focuses on the Manchu rulers as Manchus. And these scholars emphasize that they ruled not just as any other Chinese imperial house, but specifically as Manchus. And I think this is a compelling case. Other scholars, maybe from a nationalist Chinese bent, well, would say, no, the Manchus thoroughly Sinicized, Hanhua. They became like the Han. And I think there are a few points that are very, very important to remember. One is that the Manchus continue to live separately for the most part. They also continue to emphasize um, reading and writing and speaking in Manchu, so that if today you go to many historical sites in Beijing, you'll see that there still are Manchu scripts next to the Chinese scripts in places like the Forbidden City, the Gugong. Um, and then also just this queue. The queue was never abolished. The need for Han Chinese to wear, under penalty of death if they did not, the shaven forelock and the hair grown long in the back as a Manchu hairstyle for the men. This is very important. We talked about our friend here on the right in San Francisco and his choice to keep his queue. We talked about that a little bit in class and what might be behind that. So the establishment of the China trade, I think, is important. That flag in the upper left is the British East India Company flag, and then the Qing Dynasty flag, and then the American flag from the 1830s. Questions of trade balance are very important here. They become important quite early on because the demand for Chinese goods in America is much stronger than the demand for American goods in China. And so what that means is, along with the goods like ginseng and fur, other raw materials that are coming from the United States, there's also going to have to be silver going into the Qing coffers as well, because they just don't have, the American traders and the British traders as well, don't have enough goods to balance the amount of tea, especially, that they want to bring out of China. And so American and British traders and later other European traders are going to be eager to find goods that are going to balance that trade. And I think you can see where this is going because it's going to be opium. The British are going to bring Indian opium, and the Americans are going to bring Turkish opium and dump it into the Chinese economy, dump it into the Chinese market, and develop a very, very strong demand for that. And that ultimately is going to balance the trade. Now, this gets us to the question of what free trade is. What is free trade? This is an open question, and it changes with time. It is a historically specific question. What defines free trade? Is it simply adhering to laws of supply and demand within basic economic theory? Is it absolutely unrestricted trade? Is it trade with no tariffs and no quotas, adhering to Adam Smith's invisible hand? In it, where is the role for monopolies? If the British East India Company is essentially a monopoly on British trade with points east, including India and China, is that free trade? I would say it doesn't sound like free trade to me if there's a crown monopoly. And I think in that sense, it maybe puts the lie to the idea that the British are there to teach the Chinese about a lesson in free trade, which is what some of the actors in the later Opium Wars are going to talk about. Mercantilism and a kind of forceful privateering or monopoly kind of approach to the trade also is going to be important. Smuggling is smuggling part of free trade? Does free trade involve adhering to all existing laws? And does it involve adhering to the laws in your home country as well as the laws in your destination country? Well, again, in that case, opium would not be allowed under free trade principles because it had been outlawed in China since 1729. Where do you draw the line between piracy and privateering? Is slavery part of is slave trading part of free trade? That's a sort of ultimate kind of hypocritical use of the term. I open these questions to remind you that I think there is a shifting definition of what we mean by free trade, and it may be a matter of convenience how we define the term. So I just wanted to emphasize that because we didn't talk about it in too much detail earlier today, and I would have liked to have heard your thoughts a little bit more about that and what you think about when you think about free trade. We'll talk about it much more throughout the duration, and I want you to track what Professor Wang thinks about it in her book. Okay, the fortunes of the trade that are made in this period, especially when we get into the 1800s, after this very brief initial example of the Empress of China ship, the fortunes that are made are enormous. Really spectacular fortunes. Fortunes made by Warren Delano here, pictured at the left. He's the grandfather to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That's where we get the Delano, and also a relative of Teddy Roosevelt. We also have the Astors, the famous Astors you may have heard of as passengers on the Titanic, but also you can't really walk too far in New York City without bumping into something named for the Astors. An enormously wealthy family from the late 1800s. And the Forbes family, of course, of the Forbes magazine. And in China, there also are figures who gain in wealth at this time because they are the go-betweens of these merchants and the Chinese market, and Hokwa is one of them. We'll talk a little bit more about him, and you'll also encounter him in the Dongwang book. The British Empire is going to expand significantly. By the time we get to 1842, which we will get to next week, we will see the British seizure of Hong Kong, a portion of Hong Kong territory that it's going to have as a crown colony from 1842 until 1997. And we'll talk more about that as well. And then I put the question mark after American Empire. There's some questions about whether America is an imperial force in this moment. I think Dongwang takes some pains to distinguish between the Americans and the British here. And I'm interested to know your thoughts on that. What do you think about the United States as an imperial force in this moment? I think it becomes somewhat uncritically an imperial force when we get to things like the Philippines and the Boxer War and other situations. But for now, it's interesting to determine how we characterize British and American, especially actions in this part of the world, whether we call them mercantilist or imperial, what kind of language we use to describe that. Okay, I went on for a bit longer than I intended, but I also just wanted to make sure that we covered those basic slides in some detail. We can also return to those when we meet in our first Google Meet session, which will be a week from today, September 15th. Okay, as always, please send me any questions, and I look forward to seeing you again next week online.